Welcome back to the How We Can Heal podcast. Today, our guest is Dr. Judith Herman. Dr. Judith Herman is a part-time senior lecturer in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. For 30 years until retirement, she was director of training at the Victims of Violence program at the Cambridge Hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She's the author of the award-winning books, Trauma and Recovery and Father-Daughter Incest, and her newest book, Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice, was published in 2023 and called by the New York Times a beautiful, profound, and important book. She's received numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1984 and the 1996 Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. In 2007, she was named a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. Herman is recognized nationally and internationally as a pioneer in the field of traumatic stress, both for her research contributions and for her conceptual work. Today, she shares how trauma is deeply embedded into social structures, highlighting how tyranny and patriarchy contribute to violence, harm, and trauma, and make recovery difficult. She also shares what she's learned from decades working directly with victims and from her interviews and research with survivors, specifically about justice and repair. She's a legend in her own right, so I'm honored to have this conversation and to share it here with you today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Judith Herman to the show. The more you learn about trauma, the more you see it everywhere. It's a superpower to see it, and it's also necessary to see beyond it. This fall, I'm offering a new class, Freedom from Trauma. In it, I'll describe why it's essential for us to identify trauma and how we can approach healing in a way that we don't end up swimming in it. You'll learn simple, not always easy, perspective and practices to help you move out of the trauma vortex and stand in something stronger and more powerful than the impacts of harm. I'm looking forward to sharing what I know with you in this new way. Visit howwecanheal.com/freedom from trauma to register for the training. Welcome, Dr. Judith Herman, to the How We Can Heal podcast. I'm so excited and delighted and thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. I'd love to go back to the beginning and just learn about when you first learned about the word trauma and when it became a part of your reality, because it's been such a big part of your writing and your life and your teaching. So I'm curious, when did you first hear about it?
Well, we didn't have the word trauma then. Probably I could date this to 1970.
Okay.
And that year, two things happened. I had joined a consciousness raising group, actually in 69. And then in July 1970, I started my psychiatric residency. And the consciousness raising group that I belonged to was certainly a very privileged demographic, all white, college-educated women. But even in that demographic, people were sharing stories of sexual assault and sexual harassment and intimate partner violence. We didn't have those terms then.
Yeah.
None of that was named back then. The first speak out on rape, the consciousness raising groups then led to public disclosures. The first speak out on rape, I think, happened around 1970. And at the same time, when I started my residency, I was assigned to an inpatient unit. My very first two patients were women who had made suicide attempts.
Yeah.
And both of them gave histories of father-daughter incest. And one of them, in addition, had escaped from her father by marrying as a teenager to a man who became extremely abusive, as is often, it turns out, is often the case.
Yeah.
People who are physically or sexually abused as kids are between 2 and 4 times as likely to be re-victimized
Yep.
in adolescence or adulthood. And you really can't get higher than 4 times as high because the baseline's around 25%. So,
Right.
and anyway, she said, he was going to kill her anyway. So she might as well get it over with.
Wow.
And so, here was my textbook saying that incest occurred in 1 case per million.
Mm.
So what do you think were the odds
Yeah.
that an absolute newbie would get 2 cases in a month?
Yeah. Wow.
So, I mean, we didn't have the word trauma then. It wasn't until 1980, basically when, thanks to the organizing of the Vietnam veterans against the war, post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized as a real diagnosis in the diagnostic manual.
Yeah.
And by the way, they had a very similar organizing process where they began with what they called rap groups that were organized outside of the VA or the health or mental health system because they didn't trust the VA. And in fact, my colleague, Robert J. Lifton, was a psychiatrist who early on was a facilitator for some of those rap groups. And he wrote a book called Home from the War about Vietnam veterans. And it was their testimony that, they went again from sharing their stories in a small confidential group to public, speaking out publicly and saying, we're home from Vietnam, but in our heads, we're still there.
Yeah.
And so that's how trauma entered the lexicon.
How did you learn how to work with it when there's no word for it? Like what taught you or who did you go to in the early days to, as a newbie with 2 incest cases right in front of you? Like, where do you go? What do you do?
Well, I did have my women's group. And that was an enormous source of support.
Yes.
And luckily, I also had supervisors who took it seriously. I have to share this story. I think they started to take the domestic violence seriously because my patient, who was married to this very abusive man, said she was afraid of him. She didn't want him visiting on the unit.
Yeah.
And so the nurses wouldn't let him in. And he didn't like that one bit. At a certain point, he got in and he threatened the male unit director, male psychiatrist. You never saw the police get there so fast.
Oh.
Okay?
Yeah.
So after that, they took her seriously when she said he was going to kill her, because of course,
the things it takes, right?
She'd never seen the police. I mean, the police were called numerous times to her home, and they always just took him for a walk around the block, never made an arrest. But when he threatened a male psychiatrist, that was a different story.
So interesting.
So I had supervisors who did take it seriously. The other thing was when they started talking about it and somebody believed them and supported them, they got better.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they stopped being suicidal and their depression lifted. I mean, there was no such thing as battered women's shelter back then. So my patient basically used the hospital as a de facto shelter.
Yeah.
And the first transition house in Cambridge, which was either the first or second battered women's shelter, opened in 1976. Could have been 73. Boston Area Rape Crisis Center started in 1973. So, I mean, and all of these were organizations completely developed by grassroots volunteers outside the healthcare and mental health systems. When I eventually started to work at Cambridge Hospital, which was a Harvard teaching hospital, we started the Victims of Violence program. Basically, we invited the grassroots organizers to join our staff because they had the knowledge base that was completely missing in the mental health system.
So they could bring their education in and together. Right. I'm curious, just given your long history and dedication to this field, going back to times when we didn't have the word trauma, when there weren't any places for people experiencing intimate partner violence to go. How do you feel about the progress we've made in the last 4 or 5 decades in this field, in mental health and trauma specifically?
Well, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I mean, certainly in terms of public awareness of gender violence, we're in a very different place.
Yes.
I mean, with the second wave of consciousness raising and speak outs, and that led to a lot of good epidemiological research and scientific publications, and then another round with the Me Too movement. The awareness of the endemic nature of exploitation of women and children is much greater. No question about that. The effective response is a work in progress. We've had important steps forwards, like the Victims of Crime Act and the Violence Against Women Act, and then VAWA hasn't been renewed, and a lot of the Victims of Crime Act funding that went for grassroots crisis services and so on has been cut back. And so in terms of availability of grassroots services, that's kind of fluctuates.
Yeah.
The legal system response has been very minimal. Probably the biggest breakthrough is having victim witness advocates in the courts and having civil restraining orders for domestic violence. Those were 2 big achievements.
Yeah.
But in terms of basically making, the track record in terms of treating gender violence as a crime is still pathetic. I mean, rape is supposedly a felony. In fact, if you look at the percentage of cases that get reported to law enforcement, which hovers around 20-25%. And then you look at cases cleared by arrest, cases accepted for prosecution, cases resulting in conviction. You basically have an exponential decay curve. And what you see in terms of conviction rate compared to the actual prevalence of rape, maybe maximum 5% of rape cases, probably more like 2 to 3%.
Yeah.
And, because unless it's, the fantasy of a Black stranger raping a pretty blonde virgin teenager, which is extremely rare, most rape, those are pursued very vigorously.
Yeah.
But most rapes are committed not by strangers, but by acquaintances or intimates. And most rapes are committed by, once it's someone the victim knows.
Yeah.
Then, it becomes, and there are no witnesses. It becomes he said, she said, and he doesn't look like the stereotypic demon rapist.
Yeah.
He's, just a fine young man with a promising career ahead of him, a good athlete.
A lot of
So,
benefit of the doubt given to
yeah.
perpetrator and little to any given to the victim.
Well, the victim is really put on trial. Let's face it. It's sort of,
Yeah,
why was she wearing that dress?
right.
How many beers did she have?
You talk in your recent book, Truth and Repair, about so many dynamics that set the stage for this. And you share an important thought across your writing that trauma is often suppressed because it threatens social power structures. And I think that's a really powerful message. And in your book, which was published in 2023, Truth and Repair, you talk about tyranny and patriarchy and the relationship between the two. And so, since we're talking about rape and we're talking about gender violence in this way and the justice system, how it responds, what do you think everyone needs to understand about tyranny, like what that looks like, how it sets the stage for trauma?
Well, tyranny is about a relationship of dominance and subordination.
Mm-hmm.
It's about, the powerful rule, the weak submit, the bystanders look the other way because they're either intimidated themselves, they don't want to get involved because then they'll get clobbered,
Yeah.
or they're going along for the ride and collaborating, basically facilitating. They're accomplices, basically. And that type of relationship of dominance and subordination exists at every level of human organization. So it exists in intimate relationships and family relationships.
Yeah.
Can exist. It exists in workplaces, it exists in the nation state, and it exists in religious organizations.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in organized crime.
Yeah.
At every level, you can see these same dynamics, whether the dominance and subordination are based on gender or race or caste or class or religion, where the strong rule, the weak submit, and the bystanders basically try to stay out of it.
Yeah.
And the only way to change that is if the bystanders actually ally with the victims.
The bystanders ally with the victims. Yeah.
Not the perpetrators.
Yeah.
So that's why you need a social movement.
Yes.
To affect change in the tyrannical system.
Yes. And I want to talk more about affecting that change and where we can put our energy. I think there's, as a result of technology, as a result of politics and other things, we can feel really fragmented and distracted and just busy all the time. I want to talk about how to invest our energy in that positive change. But before we get there, I think sometimes when we start talking about terms, I'm interviewing Dr. Tama Bryant on this podcast too, and she talks a little bit about when people say decolonial, people get triggered, like, well, what is that? They maybe don't fully get what it means. And she'll be like, well, are you for slavery? Are you for oppressing other people? Because if you're not comfortable talking about decolonializing, then that's really what you're advocating for, these harmful dynamics. And then the people go, no, I don't want that. Right. So I think it's similar with patriarchy, where depending on the ears that are hearing it, people might start to just glaze over or shut down, or it's too big, or it's too ingrained in cultures around the world. So can we clarify, when we're talking about tyranny and we're talking about dominance and subordination, how does patriarchy fit in terms of trauma? Like, how is that perpetuating the harm that's done and the difficulty in recovery?
Whenever you have a dominant group and a subordinate group, and especially when that dominance and subordination are deeply embedded in the cultures and the traditions ultimately that dominance is enforced by violence. The
Yes.
methods of coercive control are always the same, whether you're talking about a family, whether you're talking about a religious cult, whether you're talking about a slave plantation. Ultimately, the enforcement comes down to violence. And there are many other methods of enforcement. There's violence doesn't have to be used very often. It just has to be very persuasive when it is used.
Yes.
So, if you want to keep women subordinate, you've got to make an example of some of them, and you've got to instill fear in all of them. So, don't you dare go out at night, or don't you dare wear a short dress, or don't you dare try to participate in activities where women are not supposed to be participating.
Someone was just asking me recently. I lived in Italy for a year in Bologna, and they asked if I dated while I was there. And I was like, oh, not really. I dated this one person. And then he said he was going to a soccer game, football match. Oh, I'd love to go. Oh, no, women can't go there. I would take a woman to a football game. And I was like, I think we're done here. That's enough. I've heard enough. Even if it is people are drinking and fighting, that's okay. I can go to the soccer match if I want to.
But I mean, when they started doing research on sexual assault on college campuses, for example, and that demographic is at the peak age for vulnerability. And surprise, surprise, fraternities, all male spaces, male controlled spaces, were high risk spaces. The fraternities and football teams basically, have their own tyrannical initiation rights for the members, the male members. But then once they've formed the fraternity and they've bonded as a male group, then they practice those same methods on women. That's why you get the party where the freshman girls are invited and the punch is spiked and the rooms are set aside.
Yeah. So the harm just gets passed down, and the pattern of dominance and subordination starts with the initiation in the fraternity and then goes on to impact.
Right. Where interestingly, too, that with a lot of the bystander intervention prevention organizations work with young men, a lot of the young men are scared of being targeted by other men, too.
Yeah.
And called a faggot, a wuss, a bitch, if they don't go along.
So when you think about these dynamics of tyranny and patriarchy and dominance and subordination across genders, right? You were just talking about men hazing men, and you talked about how it shows up in the workplace, right? It can show up across people. When you think about that shifting or going away, the problematic dynamics ending, what words do you have to describe what a healthy dynamic and culture looks like? One that supports trauma recovery, one that supports prevention of trauma, one that's just healthier for everyone.
The contrast with a relationship of tyranny is a relationship of equality or mutuality.
Yeah.
And again, that happens on every level of relationship.
Yeah.
Even in families where, of course, parents have much more power and knowledge than children, you don't have equality, but you can have a lot of mutuality even from a very early age. In fact, that's how children form safe attachments and are socialized.
Yes.
So that's a very basic form of relationship that allows us to live with one another.
Yeah.
And so you look for relationships of social equality.
Yeah.
Where the rules are everybody has a voice, everybody gets respect, everybody gets to participate in decision making, and the decisions are made by negotiation and compromise rather than imposing one person's will.
All of that feels so important and resonates as I raise my daughter.
Toddlers, really, you can negotiate.
Yeah.
What a toddler learns is you can't always get what you want, but you can get, how do the Rolling Stones put it? You get what you need, you know?
Yeah. So I'm curious if we're taking steps towards equality. Obviously, I think understanding trauma helps, understanding these dynamics, like seeing it seems to be one of the first steps. We're swimming in these power structures.
Right. Yeah.
And
you've got to make it, raise awareness before you do anything else.
so through the work you've done, your books, lots of people I think that see it are trying to send that message out and say, look what's happening in this dynamic and look how it's harmful. So the awareness and the education is really important. A lot of folks that listen to this podcast are mental health professionals, are in the wellness space, are helpers and healers and people Mr. Rogers says to look for in the world. So for those of us that see it and maybe just have a hard time maintaining energy forward, what would you say can anchor us in moving towards that equality? What's the vision? And maybe if there's steps that come to mind, like things we can do on the daily, on the weekly, on the yearly, what can we do to continue?
The main thing is having your own support group.
Yeah.
You can't do it alone.
You can't do it alone. And what are steps that take a social group towards more equality?
You know, I do think the small group where you start with where everybody is right now.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about a consciousness raising group or a rap group, or in the civil rights movement, they had these freedom schools where people came and again just talked about the realities of their lives. And that was the beginning of community organizing. Start with people where they are.
Yeah.
You know, what can I do about climate change? It's a worldwide problem. It's having to do with oil oligarchy. I mean, how do you start? Well, what's happening in your local community?
Yeah.
No, you probably can't take on the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates and Putin and, you know, and the oil Emirates, and not to mention our own oligarchs. But there's probably some stuff going on in your community.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where you begin.
Yeah. In your book, you talk about, and these are chapter titles too, you talk about acknowledgement, apology, accountability, especially when we're talking about the layers of trauma, the specific trauma that happens to a single victim or group of victims, and the layers outright. I feel like those are really important takeaways for folks in the justice system, for folks who are working with survivors, but also for anyone and everyone to understand the inner workings of how much trauma can harm the power structures that create that environment and allow for it, but also to find this roadmap through. When you're interviewing folks, I think there were 30 survivors that you interviewed for Truth and Repair. What are some of the things you wish everyone knew that you gathered directly from those survivors?
Well, I think the sort of main take-home message was that what the justice system offers as resolutions for crimes was not a very good fit with what victims said they wanted. Because for the criminal justice system, what it offers as a successful outcome is punishment of the offender. And that turned out to be pretty far down the list of what most survivors wanted.
Yeah.
And then what the civil justice system offers is money.
Right.
And that also turned out to be not top of list for many survivors. What the survivors wanted most, and in fact, this was unanimous, 30 out of 30 interviewees said they wanted acknowledgement, public acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And it was more important to them to get the acknowledgement from the bystanders than it was to get the acknowledgement from the perpetrator.
Yeah.
They were prepared for the fact that the perpetrator might go right on denying it.
Yeah.
But they wanted the bystanders to believe them.
Yeah.
And they wanted not only acknowledgement of the facts, but acknowledgement of the harm and acknowledgement that this was wrong.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes denial is always the first level of defense. But if you've got DNA evidence, for example, right? The next level is, so what's the big deal?
Yeah.
It's over. Let's forgive and forget. So acknowledging the harm and acknowledging that a crime occurred.
Yeah.
They wanted the bystanders to recognize the harm and denounce the crime, and they wanted the perpetrators exposed so that the bystanders had limits.
Yes.
Prevent it from happening again. That was top of list.
Yeah.
People. And so punishment, a lot of people just basically said, what good is that going to do me?
Yeah.
You know, that's not going to fix anything.
Yeah.
They were also not very excited about forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
They were not into let's forgive and forget. In fact, they were afraid of, I mean, there were exceptions. There were some people who had actually had confrontations with the perpetrator where the perpetrator genuinely apologized and showed genuine remorse. And then, you know, one woman who wrote about how forgiveness was just spontaneous. It wasn't something you had to work at. It was just, she saw this genuine remorse, and it was like a weight was lifted from her shoulders. But those were rare cases. More often, another incest survivor who I interviewed said, I think he'd get a kick out of talking about what he did.
Yeah.
He wouldn't really be sorry. He'd admit it, but he'd relish it. And then if he did admit it, my family would want me to forgive him, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And I think there was, even among the clergy people that I interviewed, that it's just too easy to pressure the victims to forgive. Yeah. It's a lot harder to actually get the perpetrators to change.
Yeah.
And get them to a place of remorse and contrition. And in fact, mostly we don't know how to do that because we've never invested in it, in any kind of serious rehabilitation effort. And we don't even know what the true prevalence is in terms of offending, and let alone the sort of spectrum of offenders, some of whom might well be good candidates for rehabilitation, and others who are true sociopaths and repeat offenders, and you really would have to segregate them. You know, the only way to keep the community safe would be to supervise them all the time.
Yeah.
So they didn't want punishment. They didn't want forgiveness. And money damages, people were very conflicted about the money.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, people say, how much money have I spent on doctors and mental health care and hospitals? But on the other hand, it would feel like dirty money.
Yeah.
They didn't want to feel like they'd been bought.
Yeah.
And of course, especially the victims of trafficking who had been sold really didn't want to be. The money just felt contaminated. There was one rape victim I interviewed who, it was one of these cases where she did report to the police. I mean, it was a former boyfriend who she had broken up with, and he raped her when she went to his apartment to retrieve some of her artwork. He's an artist, to basically punish her for breaking up with him. And she did report him to police. The DA declined to prosecute because he said, she said, and they had a prior sexual relationship, so he was going to claim consent. But she did file a civil suit, and he was found liable. And when it came time for her to say what she wanted in money damages, she said she wanted him to give $30 to the local rape crisis center. And the $30 represented the 30 pieces of silver for which Judas had betrayed Jesus. Wow. And I said to him, the guy had a lot of money. You could have asked him to give $30,000 to the rape crisis center. She said, you know, I didn't even think of that. The money was symbolic. But there is, and people should know about this, it's not nearly as well known as it should be. The Victims of Crime Act has a provision. It created what's called a trust fund, which is a fund not based on taxpayer revenues, but on fines levied on convicted offenders. And the money goes into a big pot, which is then distributed. There's both on the federal level and then there are state level. And survivor representatives sit on the advisory boards that determine how the funds are allocated. So it's like offenders as a group giving back to victims as a group.
Yes.
But there's not that sort of personal, your offender giving money to you. Yeah. It also eliminates the thing of, for civil damages, some offenders have lots of money and a lot of them don't have any money. So, and the monies will go for three things: direct victim compensation for time lost from work or medical expenses. It also pays salaries for victim witness advocates in the courts. Good. And a lot of grant funds go to victim services, like battered women's shelters, rape crisis centers. At our Victims of Violence program, we had, for years, we had VOCA support for a free homicide bereavement service that include home visiting and support groups. We had money for hospital-based victim advocates, which I think is a great idea. Yeah. You know, if you have an advocate in the emergency room, then when you see the advocate, the docs don't know how to get a restraining order or how to link victims up with services, but the advocates do. Yeah. And the advocates will even accompany the victim to court and things like that. So we have the hospital-based advocates. And then for a while, we also had a community crisis service that trained community volunteers so that when there was something like a shooting in a school, they could have a crisis response that wasn't just some strange professional parachuting in, but where community organizations could provide some direction to organize a crisis response. So it was a very creative way to hold perpetrators as a group accountable to make restitution.
And for victims to be able to receive the support without that direct line to someone who harmed them or feeling that the money is tainted or somehow, not wanting to ask that, right?
Yeah, because a lot of people want anything to do with this person.
Yeah. Yeah. No connection. Yeah. So you learned so much from these victims you've interviewed, from people you've supported throughout your career. Was there anything surprising that came up in these interviews that you learned from victims that, even with all your experience, caught you off guard?
I was actually a little bit surprised, although not totally, because victims are so often stereotyped as vengeful
Mm,
or just out for money or, just out for blood. I did ask, these were semi-structured interviews. I, mostly just said, okay, if you could write the script and you had the power to dictate exactly what happened, what would be ideal? What would represent justice in your mind? But I did ask specifically about revenge because in our criminal justice system, victims are quite marginal. It's the state that's considered the injured party, and that's why the prosecutor has the power to decide whether to go forward with pressing charges. And a lot of the rationale for that is that if you left it to victims, there would just be blood feuds. I did a training, a day-long course one time at the American Psychiatric Association annual meeting with a very well-known forensic psychiatrist about how to be an expert witness in court. He opened the morning session he put up a great big slide of the Hatfields and the McCoys, these mountain men with their mustaches and their rifles across their knees, looking very fierce.
mm,
And he said, why do we have courts? You may naively think that we have courts to mete out justice or to establish the truth. Said, the real reason is so that we can resolve disputes without firearms.
okay.
And he said, so anything short of that is, it's an adversarial system. And so be prepared to be verbally attacked and humiliated and, if you have any skeletons in your closet, forget about being an expert witness, because anything short of a physical attack is allowed.
Yeah.
But the state is in charge, because if you didn't have the state in charge, you'd have the Hatfields and the McCoys. And so that's the stereotype, that victims are going to be much more bloodthirsty and out for revenge than a judge or a jury.
Yeah.
So I did ask all my informants about revenge. And they all had revenge fantasies.
Yeah.
But mostly they hated their revenge fantasies.
Mm,
They felt like, this isn't really me.
yeah.
This is like a disgusting residue of seeing the hate up close,
Yeah.
And in fact, the woman artist I described, when I asked her about revenge fantasy, she said she'd had these nightmares all the time where she was shooting the rapist. She had one where a dinosaur came and trampled on the rapist. And in her dreams, she was delighted. And when she woke up, she was disgusted.
Mm,
I felt like, ugh, this is the last thing I want in my life.
yeah. More violence.
Violence. Interestingly enough, her husband, I interviewed him also. He was not ambivalent about his revenge fantasies at all.
Yeah.
He wanted to kill the guy.
Yeah.
And I found that to be fairly generally true, that the victims who had really seen this up close didn't want any part of it
Yeah.
and felt very ashamed of their own revenge fantasies and like they were ego alien. And in fact, one of the nice things that happens we do a lot of group therapy because, again, small groups, survivor groups are just so healing if they're well structured and well run. And one of the things that happens often late in the group when people have bonded sufficiently is they start sharing their revenge fantasies. And they can really enjoy each other's revenge fantasies.
Yeah.
I have a transcript of one meeting where this woman says, first she says she just likes to scratch his face. And the other group members say, really, is that all? And then she, well, actually, I had this idea about getting a baseball bat and kneecapping him. And so then the group goes, yeah, well, maybe you should do that with a bus coming.
I love the fierce protective anger on behalf of the other person.
And by that time they're all laughing hysterically because it becomes funny instead of a burden. It becomes sort of like they know they're just fantasies. They know that it's silly, but they can have a laugh together.
Yeah. So, since it's a fantasy, why not bring a bus?
Yeah. That they were less vengeful than oftentimes their family members or loved ones who didn't feel ambivalent about wanting revenge.
Yeah. I'm curious, just being in the place you are now, having written such influential books, Trauma and Recovery, Truth and Repair, doing such important work for so many decades, do you feel a sense of accomplishment, fulfillment, pride in that? And or do you feel a sense of restlessness, wanting things to be better, wishing everything could be further along?
I would say both and.
Yeah. So if you could write it, right? You've listened to survivors share if they could write what would happen for them in the justice system. If you could write how things would change in society, in the justice system, in mental health, what would be your narrative, your vision for, let's just say, the next 50 years?
Not sure we have that long, but
from 1975 to now, we went from not having a word for trauma to having a good amount of research and understanding. And there's some traction. Yes, it's one step forward, 10 steps back sometimes. But even if you wanted to be utopian about it, and in 50 years, if everything were resolved, what would that look like?
That's a tall order, but I would say in the mental health system, Medicare for all, and much more investment in community mental health prevention, including child abuse prevention and sexual assault prevention, which, we have good models that are very effective. Home visiting for the first year of life for first-time mothers. The payoff 20 years down the line is extraordinary.
Yeah.
But politicians don't think 20 years ahead. They think for the next budget cycle, and how do you sell something that didn't happen or isn't going to happen 20 years from now? So in the justice system, I do think there's some promising hybrid models that integrate some restorative justice principles with a retributive justice framework, and allow more victim participation, more, again, prevention and rehabilitation rather than punishment oriented interventions.
Yeah.
And, the prison system that we have, besides being absolutely useless for rehabilitation or close to it, is extremely expensive.
Yes.
So it's time to try something else. And more generally, in terms of democracy movements worldwide, I do think it's now or never, because I do think we are in an existential moment where the triumph of oligarchy does mean the destruction of the planet. So,
Yeah. High stakes.
yeah, that's a tall order, but I think you do have to have some idea of where you'd like to go.
So that we can, like you were saying, coming back to a support group, coming back to your local community. I think there are people listening to this who have positions of power in their local community, whether they're doing community therapy or they're working with juvenile justice or they're in schools or different systems. So, yeah, keeping your eye on the prize and knowing, let's look at these harmful power dynamics and let's create something different. Let's invoke mutuality and care. And you mentioned respect. And I think also, Dr. Donna Hicks breaks it down with elements of dignity, right? That we can look for in practice. And that can be really grounding, especially when there are high stakes and there's a lot going on that can make us feel fearful. Having a way to act and some place to go can be really helpful.
My mama used to say activism is the antidote to despair.
Absolutely.
My mama was always right.
Yeah. Shout out to your mama. Was she a strong influence on you? I'd imagine so, based on that comment. Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful.
She was a psychology researcher and psychoanalyst.
I didn't know that. Nice.
First generation American born.
So, yeah, my mom's a psychologist too. We have that in common.
Oh, interesting. Her name was Helen Block Lewis.
Helen Block Lewis. Have you written much about her or?
I wrote a little memoir piece about her.
Oh, I didn't know that. What's it called?
I can send it to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes too, so people can find that if it's available online. Wonderful. So, if folks listening, I mean, most people listening are familiar with trauma and recovery, are familiar with your work. If people want to follow your work beyond reading your books, is there anywhere else, a website you would direct them to?
Well, I don't do any social media. I'm very 20th century. But my colleague Frank Putnam and I have been doing a blog called What is Happening to Mental Health Care for Psychology Today. So
Nice.
that's one place.
Wonderful. You and Frank Putnam. That's amazing.
I'm also a contributor to a book edited by a psychiatrist named Bandy Lee. It's called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump.
Okay. And that's available online, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That came out and originally came out in 2017. It's now the third edition, and you can get it on Amazon in paperback or
Okay.
as an ebook.
Good to know. Yeah. What brings you hope these days?
Well, as I say, the people I've worked with all these years, if you're going to get involved in trying to make the world a better place, the people you work with are wonderful.
I once was working for an organization that taught yoga in juvenile justice centers, and they did a film. And at the end of the film was just a scroll of the name of nonprofits that had collaborated and were highlighted and were doing this amazing work. And we sat in the theater for, it felt like 30 minutes. It was just organization after organization and name after name of these
So encouraging.
investing their lives in change. And I feel like we can get distracted. If you turn on the news, it's just conflict and conflict, and we don't see, it's not always in front of our faces to see how many people are dedicating their lives to healing. And that's part of my goal with this podcast, is just to bring those conversations to the forefront of our minds, like honoring you and the work that you've done, and Frank Putnam, and all these amazing people who really care, right? Like really, truly, genuinely care about other humans.
Coming out soon called Old Before Their Time. And it's a memoir of all his work as a child abuse doctor.
Frank Putnam?
His research and his activism. So
let's bring that to the forefront of our minds and just celebrate that. So I want to thank you for coming on this show and talking with me and sharing your work and your voice all these years. It's been an inspiration for me and my work and so many people I know. So I want to acknowledge and honor and thank you for all the dedication and care you've put into your work.
Well, and thank you for what you're doing. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. Now, I'd really love to hear from you. What resonated with you in this episode? And what's on your mind and in your heart as we bring this conversation to a close? Email me at info@howwecanheal.com or share your answers and what's been healing for you in the comments on Instagram, where you'll find me at How We Can Heal. Don't forget to go to howwecanheal.com to sign up for email updates as well. You'll also find additional trainings, tons of free resources, and the full transcript of each and every show. If you love the show, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and keep sharing the shows you love the most with all your friends. Visit howwecanheal.com/podcast to share your thoughts and ideas for the show. I always love hearing from you. Before we wrap up for today, I want to be super clear that this podcast isn't offering prescriptions. It's not advice, nor is it any kind of mental health treatment or diagnosis. Your decisions are in your hands, and I encourage you to consult with any healthcare professionals you may need to support you through your unique path of healing. In addition, everyone's opinion here is their own, and opinions can change. Guests share their thoughts, not that of the host or sponsors. I'd like to thank our guest today and everyone who helps support this podcast directly and indirectly. Alex, thanks for taking care of the babe and taking the fur babies out while I record. Last and never least, I'd like to give a special shout out to my big brother, Matt, who passed away in 2002. He wrote this music, and it makes my heart so very happy to share it with you here.